How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind addresses this question. Before I turn it over to our speaker to elaborate on this topic, a few brief words of introduction. Dr. Rajan is the Katherine Dusak Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He was the 23rd governor of the Reserve Bank of India from 2013 to 2016. And previously, he was the chief economist and director of research at the International Monetary Fund. Mr. Rajan will first give remarks, and then we will open up the room for questions. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Raghuram Rajan.
Thank you very much, Derek, for that kind introduction. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps I should tell you why I started writing this book. It was really trying to figure out why capitalism worked in some countries and simply didn't work in other countries. Spent some time thinking about it. By the time I thought I had figured it out, it seemed to me capitalism had stopped working properly in the countries that I was interested in. This book is really a product of many years of thought. And before I get into it, let me first show you you have the picture there. The covers, these are actually three different covers in three different countries. The middle one is, of course, the one you have in the United States. The left one is in the UK, and the right one is in India. And as you can see, different countries have different takes on what the cover to this particular book should be. Abstract in the UK, pretty direct in the US, and even more abstract in India. Now, what that means, I'll leave for you to figure out. Let me get into the meat of the book. The standard view of capitalism is that it's about free and competitive markets. And if you're at the University of Chicago, that's all you need. If you're outside the University of Chicago, you may need perhaps a government to enforce contracts and property rights. If you want to push a little further, the government maybe extends a social safety net. But typically these views of the two big pillars, the markets and the state, neglect the third pillar, the community. And I argue that to understand why capitalism works, you have to understand the role the community plays. Of course, historically, the community has prepared people to participate in markets, given them the education and the training that they need. But also, it has served as a safety net. When people in Southern Europe lost their jobs after the Great Recession, they went back to their villages because their social security, their unemployment insurance had run out. The only people willing to take them back was, in fact, the community from which they had come, because no questions were asked. They came in and moved in with their parents or their relatives. Those kinds of supports the community provides, and we'll talk more about them. But also importantly, the community forms the basis for democracy. And I argue the reason capitalism has worked so well is primarily because democracy has helped capitalism work, and we'll see that in just a bit. When capitalism then works for the many support capitalism, and you have an equilibrium which works. I would argue in many ways the liberal market democracies in industrial countries post-World War II were precisely this, a structure which was in balance, which worked very well, until, of course, in recent years, it has stopped working. And I argue the reason it has stopped working is the same reason we've had disruptions in the past. Technological change is something which is powerful, which operates on many fronts, and has disrupted communities considerably. It's done this before. And every time society has reacted, changed, adapted, and absorbed the technological change so that once again, we have a system working for many. It's that change that we need to think about now going forward. How do we change in order to adapt to the significant technological change which has hit us? Right now, what we have is a lot of protest. The system is simply not working. It's protests from populists on the left, populists on the right. We have movements which are anti-rich, anti-trade, anti-immigration. These are to be expected, but in many situations, they don't have the answers. We need to find good new answers. And I would argue many of the answers don't lie at the national level. They often are at the local level, and they depend on reviving the local community so that it can prepare people for what they need to do in the face of technological change. With that as preamble, let me get very quickly to definitions, because it's useful to know what we're talking about. When I talk about markets, I'm talking about the whole range of markets. Markets for goods and services, the shops that you go to, but also the labor market, where we hire people and sometimes fire them, and capital markets, where we raise money through issuing stock and bonds. And finally, I also include private firms in what I define as markets. And clearly, well-operating markets expand choice for the customer and also enhance productivity for the economy. So these are its primary contributions. What about the state? The state, you've all read civics textbooks, the executive, the judiciary, the legislature. Clearly, the primary function is providing security and justice, and you have to see the difference between the United States and Congo to realize that's extremely important for a society. But in addition, over the years, it has started providing much more. In many situations, it provides what I call pre-market supports, preparing people for the market by enhancing their education, enhancing their capabilities, providing them adequate health care so that they can actually perform in the market. And often, it also provides post-market support, how it builds up safety nets so that when people fall off the markets, they don't fall very far. Unemployment insurance, social security, again, healthcare. Now, these have built up over time, and part of the book is showing you how they built up, why they built up. Often, for example, the safety net was strengthened in the face of massive economic depression. We saw that in the US with, of course, Social Security coming in 1935. That's the state. And I argue through the book that the market and state, contrary to what most people think, they think they're opposed. You have more market, you have less state. In fact, the reality, look across countries, the countries that have the strongest markets also have the biggest state. They tend to move together rather than in opposition. What moves in the other direction is typically the community. As the state grows stronger, often on the backs of markets growing stronger and integrating, the community shrinks. What do I mean by community? I talk about the proximate community, the neighborhood, the village, the municipality. And what I include in this is local government. The mayor is part of what I call the community. The ward chairman is part of what I call the community. But also it includes local schools and other local institutions. So why should I talk about the community today? After all, for many people living in metropolitan cities, it's something we don't think about because it's back there and it's gone. We don't have a sense of what our community was anymore. Well, in many situations, it still exists and still plays a role. Oftentimes, the community is a source of identity and values. I'm a Hyde Parker living in Chicago in the United States, 3 different levels of community, but we identify to some extent with all. But it also provides us a sense of values, who we are and what we think is right. I said the state provided security, justice, capabilities, and safety net. The community augments all this. For example, those Southern Europeans going back to their village, that the community provided them a safety net. It does that by emphasizing not contracts, not formal obligations, but relationships. We do it because we have a relationship with our neighbors, we have a relationship with our relatives. That is why we provide them a bed when they can't find one elsewhere. So the community augments, it fills holes that the market and the government leave behind. It augments each of their functions. But it also, importantly, provides a means of political organization. Now, for people in Chicago, remember Barack Obama learned how to be a politician as a community organizer, right? That was not so long back. The need for community means that even in metropolitan areas where we have fairly limited methods of engaging with each other, we still find ways of building solidarity. In India, in the cities, what we have is apartment buildings where kids run into each other's houses. At dinner time, you look around, whose kids are with me? Need to feed them, right? You don't ask, who are you, etc. Everybody knows everybody else. There's a lot more anonymity in modern cities, but still you strive to get to know each other. For example, in Hyde Park, the lab school is a big source of engagement. We're often friendlier with the parents of our kids' friends. That's how we make friends. And we stay with them through school. We know we actually become very close. But again and again, we find different ways of social engagement. The Chicago Council is one of those ways of social engagement that we find in modern cities. Now, of course, in this day and age, whenever I start talking about local community, people say, why do you talk about local community as the basis for social engagement? After all, so much of people's lives are spent in virtual communities, on the net, on social media. And clearly, over the last few months, we've recognized that it is harder to trust on the net. It's harder to trust information. It's harder to trust the other side. We don't even know if the other side is a person or a bot. With real people, that's not a problem. But moreover, with real people, you get real engagement. With the online community, yes, you can opt into many more activities than you could with real people, but it's light engagement. You can opt out also very easily. That's why it's very easy to get a flash mob to protest something or the other, get them together very quickly, but to get them to come every day for years on end, to get a movement together which pushes for change, you need much more of a real organization. But in truth, in today's world, both interact. So the book talks about a example of a Toronto developer who essentially created the classic experiment for economists. He started wiring his development together, and unfortunately found a technical glitch halfway through and could wire only half the community. The other half was left unwired. And so sociologists got to know of this and said, wonderful. Let me see if the guys who are wired are more sociable after a few months than the guys who are left unwired. It turns out that even though the people who were wired had the opportunities to spend all that time surfing the net, they didn't. They actually spent more time interacting with each other. Neighborhood parties, search parties for dogs that got lost, search parties for kids that got lost. They were much more sociable. And the question is, why were they more sociable? Because they could traverse closed doors. Because through email, they could get assemblies together. So the virtual, the ease of contact through virtual combined with the real, that there were actual people to get together, they knew each other much better than the ones that were not wired. Parenthetically, they were so together that they decided it was wonderful. They wanted the internet to continue to be provided free by the developer. And they organized to push him to actually do it. And then they went to the city council to complain against him and so on. At the end of it, the developer decided he would never wire a community together again. So that was interesting. But I also argue that in some ways, if we think about the future, where we have much more extreme automation than we have today, where we have more artificial intelligence than we have today, many of the jobs will center around social relationships. And therefore, the community, the real community, the local community will become much more important because that is where I think many more of us will find jobs. Just as one reason why this is true, I mean, think of today that one of the problems facing many aging developed countries is the problem of loneliness. 20% of Americans say they're lonely, and typically this means they haven't talked to anybody during the day. And in the UK, the numbers are 40% and above. As people age, this is going to become much more of a problem, which is why, again, I say that many of the jobs in social service and elsewhere will be in catering to the needs of people who are left out of society, which is why I think the community will become much more important again. And finally, why don't I talk about what Benedict Anderson calls imagined communities, communities where we really don't know each other, but we feel we're part of a larger whole, like the nation or some strong religious interactions. And many of these are attempts to provide the kind of identity that the community no longer provides. There are many good things about the nation we'll come to a little later, but in many ways, when the community no longer provides an adequate identity, you look for identity in broader structures. And that sometimes means look for it in nations, which is why when communities start failing, you get the rise of various forms of nationalism, something that Hannah Arendt has talked about. And this is where I argue that some of those passions are, in a sense, untethered to real human activity, to real human decency. And when they get untethered, they can go very far in the wrong direction, which is why it's very important, again, to focus on rebuilding community when it's broken down. So here is the entire model of the book. And let me be very, very quick about this. 3 pillars: state, markets, and community. We know the state provides legislation, regulation, antitrust, property rights, all that to markets. We know that the state provides security, justice, capabilities, and the safety net to the community. What is important are the arrows going the other way also. I argue that one reason why the state has been relatively contained and has not become authoritarian in liberal market societies is because the markets themselves have been relatively independent of the state. So long as the state does the overall structure, the markets themselves are not dependent on the state and exercise an independent countervailing power. It's one reason why, for example, Jeff Bezos from Amazon can fund the Washington Post, which is critical of the administration in many ways. That's not possible in many other countries where the prominent business people depend on the government significantly for favors. Because the business is not competitive in those countries, they become effectively dependent on the government. Dependent on the government for tariffs, dependent on the government for subsidies, dependent on the government for government advertisements, and therefore they cannot stand up as an independent check. The other aspect, which I think is equally important, is the community also exercises democratic oversight and prevents too much of a coalition between the state and markets. This has happened time and again in the United States. The populist movement in the 19th century, for example, in the United States, was in many ways the anger of farmers who felt they'd been led into farming land which was not that productive, which was hit by drought, but also because the railroads were charging them enormous amounts to transport their grain, and the banks were charging them enormous interest rates to give them loans. So the protest, the populist protest, was fundamentally about the monopolization of business and the monopolies that they faced. They wanted to open up business to essentially break the monopolies. And the Sherman Antitrust Act, for example, in 1890, was a direct consequence of that populist movement saying, we want opportunity. We want the opportunity to succeed. And to that extent, I would argue the democratic oversight the community provides is a very healthy force, because this is oversight provided by people who essentially want access because they don't have influence. It's the small guy, the forgotten guy, who wants a part of the opportunities that are created for elsewhere, for everyone else. And that is very healthy in a democratic society in preventing the collusion that closes opportunities for everyone else. The collusion that right from Adam Smith, economists have worried about. And finally, I think the last two, we already saw markets provide productivity and choice, but the community, in turn, governs the values and norms that influence the market. There are some chapters early on in the book which talk about the history of how this came about. It is very interesting to learn that today what corporations are enjoined to do, maximize shareholder wealth, would have been considered a sin in the 15th century. It was a sin of avarice, because you're trying to extract more from people. You're trying to charge a higher price than the just price. All you should do is charge the just price, because that is adequate to maintain your station. Anything more, and you're essentially exploiting the buyer. How values have changed. It used to be that you shouldn't do that, otherwise you'd rot in hell, and hell was a pretty damning thing at that time. Today, that's what you have to do to earn your bonus. And what this also implies is values can change again. And what I talk about in the book is how you may see some of those values changing. So that was the equilibrium. The first third of the book is about explaining how we got to that equilibrium. And there is how we got the liberal market society. Now, how has that been disrupted? Again and again, you can see two main forces. One, severe calamity. A calamity like the Black Death, which carried away 1/3 of Europe, essentially transformed social relationships and put an end to the feudal system. But we also had great calamities. The first Great Depression, most people don't remember that 1873 to 1893 was the first Great Depression. 1929 to 39 was only the second Great Depression, but we still call it the Great Depression. These had massive effects on how societies changed. Much of social security came in different countries based on the reaction to these Great Depressions. Today, we have a third big factor, which is technological change. Today's technological change, the ICT revolution, is essentially affecting each of the three pillars. First, it has affected markets. Clearly, because companies can control processes very far away and get real-time information on what's going on, we can build out global supply chains. As soon as we are able to build out global supply chains, we do work where it's most efficient to do work. It used to be because R&D and design was done in the industrial countries, because marketing and finance was done in the industrial countries, it also made sense to keep the rest of the supply chain in the industrial countries. Make the cars here, because why send it elsewhere? Because everything else was here. As you've been able to cut up the various parts of the supply chain, you can send production there while keeping everything else here. The classic example being the iPhone, of which you sell it for $1,000 here, because it's gotten even more expensive now. But sell it for $1,000 here, $300 is manufacturing there. And you can't do it at $300 if you brought it back here. It will cost you significantly more. It gets manufactured by Foxconn in Taiwan and China for $300. The remaining $700 is value added here. But because you've been able to separate the two, who gets hurt? The worker in manufacturing in the industrial countries gets hurt because he's competing with workers there. He doesn't benefit anymore from the R&D that Apple does, because that R&D can be separable from the rest of the manufacturing process. What this has also implied, so one class of people at in the middle income, people whose jobs can be automated, people whose jobs can be outsourced, have effectively lost out. The accountant who essentially knew every part of the tax code is no longer needed because all you need is tax software. TurboTax essentially encapsulates all that he knows. And therefore, that accountant has lost his job in the same way as the manufacturer worker has also lost his jobs. You're getting jobs both at the lower end and jobs at the higher end. The jobs in the middle are vanishing. Now, what this also means is that increasingly industries are being dominated in this knowledge economy by larger and larger firms, what some authors call the superstar firms. They have scale because of global supply chain. They have scale because managers now can manage many more people. The span of control a CEO can have is significantly larger. But they have scale also because they depend on protected intellectual property, and they can deal with network effects, which essentially mean that if you already have the customers, you will get still more. This sort of structure essentially creates very well-paid large firms dominating the globe. What this also creates, these effects of technology, are what one calls superstar jobs or superstar professions. That lady on the left is Elizabeth Billington. She was the star of the London Opera in 1801. Elizabeth Billington essentially could fill the entire opera house, and she was renowned. But she made only between 10 and 15,000 pounds a season because all she was singing to was the audience in the opera house. How many could she sing to in an entire season? 10 to 15,000 pounds, a lot of money in that time. In today's time, it still is a lot of money, but it's about $1 million. The lady on the right is Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift, in 2016, made $170 million, right? That's 170 times what Elizabeth Billington made. Even though both were really at the top of the profession. Why did she make $170 million? Because her songs are downloaded not in the thousands, not in the 100,000s, not in the millions, but in the billions. Her song, she reaches a worldwide audience, which is why she gets paid the kind of sums she gets paid. This is increasingly true, not just of divas, but also true of top-notch lawyers. It is true of, top-notch professors. It's true of consultants. The top is getting more of a winner-take-most nature. The very top people make most of the money. But this has profound effects, which I'll come to in just a second, on the community. So the first point was simply technology has allowed a much greater globalization. The second point is technology, therefore, because markets have become global, the state is also becoming global. Because firms operate on a much bigger platform than they used to before, the state has to accompany them. In the 19th century, capital requirements were set at the town level, because that's where a bank operated. Within the town, the bank's capital requirements, how much capital it had to hold so that it could operate, was set by the town. As we got banks operating more at a state level, the capital requirements were set at the state level. And then, of course, banks became national banks, and capital requirements were set at the national level. Today, most banks are international banks. Where are capital requirements set? Well, they're largely decided in Basel, in Switzerland. In other words, as the markets become more international, the state and its functions has become more internationalized. That's the second effect of technological change has happened over the last 30 or 40 years. More and more functions are moving up to the national level and beyond to the international level. Both these effects have, in a sense, disrupted the community. First, of course, as powers move up, they move out of the community. The community is given less and less to do because more and more is done at the national and international level. But the community is also affected by these in very different ways. We know that trade has hollowed out towns with one industry. Steel City, Illinois is one example. But on the other hand, it's had wonderful effects in New York or San Francisco, where these winner-take-most professions can flourish because they now cater to the whole world. So what technology and trade have done is had very differentiated effects across the United States. Now, you would think, okay, that's part and parcel of normal life. Some do well and some don't. The problem is it's also made it much harder for the communities that are not doing well to succeed anymore. Think of what I talked about, that as technology advances, the incomes at the top level, the professional incomes increase because it becomes more winner take most. Well, in that case, if you're looking for your kids' welfare, you want to know, how do I make it such that they get one of those jobs when they grow up? Well, the answer is send them to the best schools today. Now, what is the best school? It is where there are other very well-prepared kids who come to school. Today, if you are a child born in a professional household, you hear many more words by the age 2 than if you're a child born in a poor household. That's just because of the nature of the household. But you also get better nutrition, you get better norms and habits, which then means by the time you're ready to go to school, as my colleague Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago's economics department says, you basically made for life or you're done. Either way. By age 5, you've got pretty much what you need to take you through. Now, if I'm a parent trying to decide, where do I put my kid? I want to put my kid in school where all the other kids have had those advantages, where all the other kids are smart, challenging kids who are going to absorb what the teacher teaches and improve the classroom experience for my kids. So in a sense, when I'm deciding where to put my kids in school, I want to go to the community which is the most expensive community I can afford, because that's where my kids are going to be surrounded by the most challenging classmates. I call this the secession of the successful. We've seen this happen in the United States. When you look at communities, the communities that were mostly in the middle, mixed communities, are now seeing increasingly a separation. You've got far more communities with poor people and rich people, and very few communities in the middle. The integrated community is breaking down, and why it's breaking down is because of these forces of technology. There are no villains in my book, but there are forces which create these problems, which we have to deal with. And I think that's far more frightening than villains. Villains, you can say, okay, let me figure out how to straighten this person out. Maybe 30 years in jail will do good for them. When you come to societal forces, something as good as technology is having such adverse effects. It becomes much harder to think about. So what is the consequences of all this? It means that there's more pressure on me to get a good schooling because that's what technology demands, but less ability for me to get that because I am in a community where the schools are failing, where social decline has set in at the same time as economic decline. We have teenage pregnancies, we have broken marriages, we have an opioid problem. All this primarily because we don't have jobs. So it's not surprising that people get angry. It's not surprising that they see that the path to progress has been cornered by the elite. There are impediments to their building capability. There are impediments to them opening businesses. And so we get the anti-elite populist movement, whether it's in France with the Gilets jaunes or whether it's in the United States. Some of this can be populist nationalist, which pushes the majoritarian identity, because in these declining communities, that sense of identity is also breaking down. Let's make thus and such country great again, because that gives the communities something to look forward to, and that appeal is very strong. It's also appealing because you can point to some villains, the minorities, the outsiders who've taken your jobs, and all you have to do is trust me because I'll bring them back. Similarly, you get populists of the left who say the answer is effectively redistribution. But really, we need to talk about how do we prepare communities for the future so that they don't really have to depend on these forces. And just an example of a community lashing back against broader opportunity, look no further than Long Island City, Queens, essentially saying, we don't want those 25,000 Amazon jobs, each paying $150,000 apiece, because we know many of us are not going to get it. We're not prepared for that. So if, in fact, those $150,000 jobs come here, yes, a few of us will get it, but we'll get a great influx of outsiders, and that could disrupt the community. We can talk a little bit more about that. But essentially what these trends do is the way we are reacting to them is positioning us very poorly for the future. Think about one of the biggest forces being technological change. If we want good jobs in the future, we need better skills. They're not going to be provided by erecting barriers to trade. Because after all, one of the biggest destinations for our goods and services in the future is going to be all those young emerging markets out there. The countries in Africa, the countries in South Asia, the countries in Middle East, which will stay young even as our populations age. So we need an open world. Closing it off at this point is really shooting our future foot, shooting ourselves in our future foot, in our future feet. Similarly, I think when you think about population aging, you have to start thinking, who is going to pay our bills? As our entitlements come due, who is actually going to support the aging workforce? And ultimately, because in many developed countries, couples have stopped having many children, it has to be some form of immigration. So yes, no doubt it needs to be controlled immigration, but it has to be a sensible form of immigration. We can't erect walls against all forms of immigration. We need to start thinking about that. So the growth of the rest, the need for immigration, and the need to prepare our population for technological change, all this suggests we need different answers from the ones the populists are giving. But ultimately, I think one of the strongest reasons for us to stay engaged with the world and not disengage are global problems like climate change. We need to deal with that. It's much harder to deal with climate change, to have a dialogue in Paris or in Geneva when you're also applying 25% tariffs to the other guy's goods. So we need a dialogue where we actually can talk to each other. Populist nationalism just takes us closer to autarky, war, and climate devastation. What needs to happen? Let me just end here because I want to give you time for questions. Nationalism should be a means of integrating. I'm not against nationalism, but it should be a means of integrating diverse communities rather than dividing. So I talk in the book about a kind of civic nationalism, bolstered by taking back some of the sovereignty that has gone to international arenas over time. I call that responsible sovereignty because in addition to the sovereignty also comes the responsibility to be a good player in the global arena. I think we need to work on how we can make that possible, but that certainly is one part of the answer. Take back some powers, but use them much more responsibly than we have in the past. I would say the same approach has to be had within the country. We need to push powers, push funding back into the community, especially communities that have been left behind. We need them to both do what they've always been doing, improve security capabilities and safety net for their people, but also rebuild the sense of identity in their people so that nationalism is no longer their primary source of identity, but also that they can get a sense of agency within the community. We can affect our own futures and get a sense of political engagement. Now, in doing this, I think we should use technology as far as we can. The beauty about technology is it allows us new solutions to old problems. For example, people say, when you push more power to the community, you will get corrupt officials who steal the money. So it's not a good idea. Well, we have far better ways of controlling corruption through transparency from on top. You can document, and this has been done in many countries, document the flow of funds. Who got what funds and how has that been spent? But you can also get bottom-up monitoring of the officials. For example, even in the city of Chicago today, we have an app, See, Click, Fix. You see a pothole, you can locate it on the GPS, click, and you can actually register it as a complaint with the municipal authorities, where they have to tell you how long it took them to fix it. I think there's a lot that technology can do in terms of improving our engagement and our governance. And I think we need to think about how to do it more effectively. So the last sort of proposal is we think about new forms of community. I call it inclusive localism. Localism because it's more empowered, but inclusive because not the old community building walls around itself, but which is open to the flow of goods and services and people within the country. That, to my mind, is what diverse countries, whether the United States, Canada, France, or India, need to think about as they go forward if they are to manage these diverse forces which are hitting us. Let me stop here and take questions.
We will turn it to the audience now. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If not, I have some questions online. Feel free to send them in online if you don't want to ask a question on microphone, but we have one right back here to start.
Idea with the 3 pillars. Who were your influences in that concept, and especially with the forces and ideas flowing back and forth among them?
I mean, it's 28 years of learning and reading and so on, but I learned a lot of sociology over the last so many years. The values of bringing an economist's eye or an economist's viewpoint to some of the questions that people have looked at for a long time. I've certainly done a fair amount of research in those areas, but when you read all of this together and then start thinking, I think it all comes together. There are, greats in sociology. Karl Polanyi was a very important influence very early on, but I think it's just a matter of reading, assimilating, and then developing your own views.
Great. More questions. Over here on the side.
Thank you. You're an atypical economist. You seem very positive and progressive in that sense. You mentioned that the growth of capital caused states to become more than just a state and become basically multinational forms of government. It seems the corollary is that as problems emerge and the cycles of economies change through time, a bad cycle creates the wobblies, a bad cycle creates socialists, a bad cycle creates communists or fascism. Can you see, as you look forward, that at some point you'll see another movement, some blending of all the previously mentioned discontents, and that would be fueled by the internet and fueled by that sense of global despair?
I certainly think that's a possibility. And I think, my friend Paul Tucker, who was deputy governor at the Bank of England, says it's 30 years to revolution. I'm not so pessimistic, because I think the primary force creating some of the problems, not so much trade, but technology. 4 out of 5 jobs are lost because of technology, not because of trade. I think technology can provide those solutions. In many ways, what we've seen is technological change happen before it creates the growth, the productivity growth that will allow that change to be absorbed more widely. And so what we need to think about is both a sort of holding operation. Till that growth comes in, what can we do? And also, how do we prepare our people better, right? So, we have a ton of people now driving Uber cars, and they're doing it very young. Is this job going to be there 12 years from now? Well, Uber itself is thinking of automating that job away. So in that sense, are we doing a good job counseling people? Are we doing a good job offering them the opportunity for alternatives? And how do we move them into those alternatives without them becoming indebted for life? Those are the things we need to think about. And this book is an attempt to say, we still have some time. But we've spent the 10 years since the global financial crisis talking about one stimulus after another without recognizing that we need societal change.
I might turn to our online questions for a minute, and we may expand this a little bit. Would an idea like universal basic income be a turning point for stability in the third pillar, or any other fundamental ideas?
I talk about universal basic income, and I worry that it seems like this magic solution. Even if you could get the taxation that is necessary, and typically to get a reasonable level of universal basic income, you need a considerable increase in taxation of the people paying taxes. But set that aside, I think it's in one way defeatist because it accepts that we won't have jobs. Ultimately, a lot of people get identity, get a sense of purpose through their jobs. Not all jobs, but many get them through their jobs. For them to sit at home and get a handout may actually take that means of engagement away. Moreover, it may be that we're going, at least today we have unemployment at 3.8%, it's not an issue. But even going forward, when that Uber driver is automated, a whole set of new jobs can emerge. I mean, how satisfied are you with the amount of healthcare you're getting? If you want an appointment with a doctor, it's 2 months down the line. By that time, the problem has probably gone away just on its own. That's how a whole lot of healthcare takes place. Just hope it goes away. If on the other hand, that person could be trained for 6 months in inputting your symptoms into a computer where the AI would spit out a diagnosis, a doctor would spend basically 3 minutes saying, do I agree, do I not agree? Pass it over, you get at least some healthcare quite soon. There could be jobs like this. As soon as you put a universal basic income in place, you're admitting there are no jobs like this. We're going to send everybody home on gardening leave. That becomes more problematic. Of course, there are ways you can tweak universal basic income, but my sense is that its time hasn't come. What we need to be thinking about is how do we position people so that they can take all the kinds of jobs that technology will provide. I have no doubt universal basic income will be necessary 50 years, 100 years from now when machines do all the work and none of us need to actually go to the shop floor or teach or do anything of that sort. We'll all be lounging on the beaches reading books and somebody will provide our income. That's fine, but we're not there yet.
Keep your jobs for now. Question right here we'll go here and then we'll go here next, please.
I know you're talking about, you're spending some time talking about identity, but I'm wondering how do you get people to focus on community when what we're really dealing with right now is kind of a set of divergent identities? You have what in our current political climate are being called the nationalists versus the globalists, people who are living in small towns and small communities that don't have a whole lot more in common with a population that frequently deals with cross-border issues that have more in common with someone on the other side of the world than they do in their own backyard. So I'm wondering how you make all those things sort of fit together.
Well, instinctively, I believe that some of these identities that are proposed, white identity, Hindu identity, these try and bring together a whole lot of people under a broad roof. But very important to these identities is who's excluded. Because who's excluded identify the ones that are in the tent and make the people in the tent feel much stronger and much more sort of linked. Of course, one can ask, what are really the links between people who are termed white? You have a Polish American here, you have an Irish American here, you have somebody else with a very different origin, a very different language. And so that's the worry about those kinds of identities is that they're not very cohesive. And when people bank on them, they look for alternatives to make them cohesive. External enemies, internal enemies. And that's what I think is one of the reasons why I propose that we go down to more local identities, because they're less damaging than attempts at national identity. Now, you don't force a local identity. People have to get that sense. I mean, but to some extent, by making the community healthier and wealthier, I think there's a stronger identification with it at that point than if it is a collapsing community with social problems, with problems of crime and so on. It becomes harder to get that sense of togetherness, engagement, and identification. I talk in the book about a community, the Pilsen community, which sort of brought itself up from that sense of disintegration. It had 21 gangs in a space of 1.5 miles. It had a murder rate which approached the death rate in Germany in World War II. That was the kind of war zone it was. And it is now a place where its real problem is too many people with higher incomes are moving in now because it's a nice place to live in. They brought the community out.
We're going to go up here really quick, and then we'll come right back to you, because I think we have a response here. There's a mic coming.
Global issue. I'm sorry. Which I notice, there's a global issue of brain drains. People from Cuba, from Africa, from all different parts of the world that come to the United States. Why do they do that? Because their countries are unsafe and they're corrupt. So on one hand, we have brilliant Indian doctors and all kinds of extraordinary people, but this is not just a problem here. It's a problem that is a global issue.
Yeah. No, of course. And you've pointed to the fact that essentially the capable have more mobility. The brilliant engineering student in India can get a scholarship and leave, and of course, India's paid a lot to get that student educated. However, I do think, and this is where a certain degree of openness is important, that they also go back. They also start up ventures, a lot of ventures started by expats who worked for a US multinational, going back to lead foreign direct investment back in India.
They do in India, but they don't in a place like Cuba, which is a communist country. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, so there are some countries which have more problems than others, and there is a level of development where the reverse brain drain is actually quite, China is reaching those levels where increasingly brilliant Chinese professors here go back to China because they're well-funded, they have a good position in the university, and they feel a part of the national drive. But I think this is all to the good in the longer term. Short term, probably bad because you're losing capable people. And that's one thing I talk about in the book. How do you get back your capable people? Because that's important in strengthening the community. But also, I think we shouldn't be too worried. If we create a bit of the virtuous cycle, reduce crime, reduce corruption, see some sense of growth, a lot of people want to come back, because they want to be with their neighbors that they grew up with.
All right, sir in green has been very patient. Thank you.
Sir, a week ago, I went to Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave between Lithuania and Poland and the Baltic Sea. It's a town of 500,000 people. I was born there a long time ago when it was called Königsberg. In 1 week, I didn't see one homeless person, not one beggar. Why?
I was hoping you'd tell me. I don't know. I unfortunately don't know Kaliningrad structure that well to be able to explain to you. But maybe we should talk afterwards so that you can tell me why it is that way.
All right, we have time for one more question. Sir, right there.
So along the lines that you mentioned, the relationships between markets and the state, and some of the countries or places where a set of collusion is created that closes the access. So along those lines, a recent problem across the globe is income inequality, For example, if we mention India, the top 1% of the population is generating 57% of the GDP, taking 22% of the national income, and just the top 0.1% earns equal to the bottom 50% of the country. And this is a global trend among emerging market economies. So along the lines of the societal factors such as technology that you mentioned that are bringing change in the society and the economy, what do you think, along what intellectual and economic framework should we approach the problem of income inequality without, siding towards extreme left or extreme right proposals?
It's a very good question. I think there are some aspects of income inequality, which, as I argued earlier in the talk, are generated by technological change and the greater arena over which somebody with good skills can operate, which increases their income relative to the rest. How do you reduce that income inequality? Well, either you can tax them to bejesus, or you can also increase the capabilities of the rest. As you produce more people who have those kinds of capabilities, then income inequality diminishes, right? And my sense is as we go forward, we will do probably a little bit of both. We will probably tax more to provide the resources, but I keep emphasizing in the book, resources aren't the primary constraint. The real constraint is trying to figure out how to change things, because you can pour a lot of money and not make a difference if that money is not well spent. So we need communities to take responsibility to say, we are going to make a difference. This is the kind of training we need. We don't need that kind of training. That doesn't work here because there are no jobs for that kind of training. We need this kind of training. We need to improve our schools. A lot of kids don't do well in college, even if you fund them, even if you offer scholarships, simply because they haven't had a good schooling. So it starts at a very early stage. So I would rather that we elevate everybody rather than have very diverse rules for people. How do we elevate everybody? That's why I come back to focus on the areas that are not doing well and essentially try and figure out ways of empowering them so that they can pull themselves out. Let me end by saying I've spent a lot of time in international development. And again, you see that the guys in the center, the guys in the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, they have a lot of prescriptions for countries, but it's not clear that any country has grown rich following those prescriptions. Typically, countries decide, South Korea decides. When South Korea and India were as poor as each other, the betting was India, because it had a lot more consultants, would do much better. Turns out South Korea did, right? India is doing reasonably well now, but it's taken a fair amount of time, and it's behind South Korea. Countries figure out what they need to do. A Park Chung-hee emerges. A Paul Kagame emerges. These are not necessarily your friendly democratic ruler, but they figure out what needs to be done and pull the country forward. And I think similarly, we should trust communities to figure out ways. And there are many stories of communities where a leadership group has decided we're going to do these things differently. Galena, a few, maybe 100 miles from Chicago, essentially was a defunct town because the river had silted over, and because lead sulfide was no longer, which is where the name Galena came, was no longer a big market. At one time, Galena was thought of as a competitor to Chicago. Now it was a godforsaken place where people were leaving, until a mayor came in who said, I'm going to turn this, and the way he turned it was to create a tourist attraction. The boarded up houses on Main Street became Old Town Main Street overnight. Nicely painted up, nicely refurbished. They discovered that Ulysses S. Grant had a house in Galena. That became a major attraction. They started a county fair. Now it is, a real tourist attraction for people from Chicago. They turned it around. Would somebody sitting 1,000 miles away have figured that out? A lot of answers lie locally, which is what I think we should be thinking about for community development in the same way as we thought for international development.
All right, the third pillar is available for signing in the corner. The books are pre-signed tonight. Thank you to BMO, our partners at BMO, for supporting tonight, and thank you, Dr. Rajan.